a happy home. So with an unhappy, short-tempered wife, Ed turned to the bottle. According to Gladys, Ed, quote, habitually became intoxicated. He became a profligate drunkard without ambition or purpose in life other than to be down drunk or with women other than his wife, said his wife. Ed would counter that Gladys, quote, was reared in her girlhood in a life of luxury, her parents being wealthy, and she, being unrestrained, acquired habits of extravagance and of following her own ideas as to worldly pleasures without restraint. So, what they were getting at is, Gladys ran around on Ed. Boy, I got some juicy soap opera stuff in the book about that. And Ed drank and ran around on Gladys. There were explosive incidents throughout. Several times, Gladys left their ranch after one of these things, and she brought her little girls to the splendid Johnson ranch house for long stays. Her mother, Nanny, who eventually nagged her husband and Gladys and just about everybody else, you can imagine how she teed off on old Ed. Please allow me to get ahead of the story just for a second. After Frank Hamer, the great Texas Ranger, later married into the family, Nanny nagged him. And once Nanny got so mad that she told Hamer she wished she were a man for 5 minutes. And he looked at his rather unpleasant mother-in-law and said, Madam, so do I. He didn't take care of her. Finally, Gladys went into Snyder and climbed the stairs of her father's bank to the second floor law offices of Judge Cullen Higgins. That's this handsome man right here. Cullen Higgins was the oldest son of trail driver, feudist, gunfighter, Pink Higgins. My great-grandfather rode for him during the feud he was involved for him. Pink had 9 children, more than any other gunfighter of note. Wild Bill Hickok never had a kid. Neither did Bat Masterson or all kinds of these guys. Doc Holliday. Pink had 9 children, and they all turned out well. One of his daughters married Emmett Johnson, Gladys's oldest brother. Cullen Higgins became a superb attorney, district judge, and a devout Methodist. He was on retainer to Billy Johnson, and his office was in the second floor of Billy's First National Bank building. Reluctantly, he agreed to file for divorce on behalf of Gladys. Ed counterfiled. The first divorce hearing was held at Post City in the Garza County Courthouse on July 25th, 1916. Now, the night before the hearing, Post's Algerita Hotel, a building that still stands, it was filled with witnesses and supporters of Ed and Gladys for the next day. The atmosphere was poisonous and everybody was armed. In the upstairs hallway of the hotel, Gladys encountered G. McMeans. Now, he was a one-time lawman, cowboy, and gunman who had married Ed Sims's oldest sister. With patriarch Dave Sims in bad health, in fact, Dave would die right after this feud of stomach cancer, G. McMeans, his oldest sibling and as an experienced gun hand, he assumed a leadership role with the Sims clan. Well, in that hotel hallway, Gladys and McMeans quarreled on sight very loudly. And then they angrily produced pistols. Gladys packed an automatic all her life. Doors opened all along the hallway and people ran upstairs from the lobby to see what the ruckus was all about. Well, what they saw was Gladys and McMeans in a standoff, brandishing pistols while shouting at each other. When a law officer tried to seize that automatic out of her hand, a scuffle broke out and the gun went off, but that slug went wild. The sheriff ordered everyone disarmed. An arsenal was collected. They put the guns of one faction in the First National Bank and the guns of another in an office building right next door. Next morning, everyone was searched for weapons as they entered the courtroom. A woman was temporarily deputized to search the ladies because Gladys, for one, wasn't going anywhere without a gun. Later in the year, a divorce was granted. Ed soon married Mildred Gerard. Now, Mildred was a one-time friend of Gladys. While working as a dressmaker for Gladys, Mildred carried on an affair with Ed. And now she was married to Ed. Ed and Gladys continued to clash over the custody of their daughters, Trix and Beverly. This was particularly bitter. While sadly we're accustomed to these custody battles today, doesn't make it a whole lot easier, but they had never had much of anything like that in those days. Very hard to get used to. Ed was ordered not to set foot on Johnson property. Beverly told me that on the occasion of her 7th birthday, which would have been in November of 1916, Ed brought her a little pony, and he couldn't even open the gate to give it to her. He had to kind of slip it through the wire. and get to her that way. Next month, Ed drove to Snyder to pick up Trix and Beverly for a prearranged Christmas visit scheduled to begin on Saturday, December 16th, 1916. Well, he came over on Friday, a long way. On Friday night, in a crowded Snyder drugstore, Ed drew a gun on Billy Johnson, one of the most prominent men in town, and berated him for trying to turn his daughters against him. But that was probably Nanny's doing. Nevertheless, later that night, out at the Johnson Ranch house, Gladys and her volatile brother Sidney were infuriated when their father told them about this incident. The next morning, Sidney stashed a shotgun in his father's bank. Gladys reluctantly packed up Trix and Beverly, headed for town. The Snyder Square was crowded with Christmas shoppers. When Gladys pulled up and parked right in front of the bank, as agreed, the county sheriff and town marshal hovered nearby as Ed approached, just in case there was trouble, but it turned out they wouldn't be able to move fast enough. Gladys was seething. The little girls picked up on it, and they were crying. Ed reached into the back seat to get their little suitcases out, and then he reached for Beverly, and Gladys exploded. She produced her automatic, reached across Beverly, and triggered 4 rounds rapid fire. "Blank, damn you," growled Ed, grappling for the gun, and he did manage to knock it away, but he had already been hit twice. Both wounds were minor, but he staggered away from the car. "You see what you've done?" he exclaimed. "I'm unarmed." Billy Johnson barreled out of the bank. When he heard those guns going off, he scooped up his granddaughters and carried them into the boardroom. Now, Beverly told me everything in the world about all this, but she blanked out about this thing. She remembers nothing until she reached the boardroom. She does not remember her mother reaching across her and shooting her daddy. Our psychology professor here, Don Conklin, told me that it was, quote, quote, dissociative amnesia, repressed memory, and, to use a more modern term, post-traumatic stress disorder. Anyway, while Billy Johnson hustled his granddaughters to safety, Sidney stepped out into the street with that shotgun and blasted Ed with a load of buckshot. Ed was carried into a drugstore and a doctor was summoned, but the wounded man gasped his last breath within minutes. A somber crowd of friends came over from Post to take Ed's corpse back home. Now, at a time of frequent childhood deaths, I mean, parents just lost their children. It's so sad. You go through these old graveyards. They hadn't lost anybody. They had a hardy bunch of 10. But now the beloved oldest son had been gunned down on a public street in front of his children. A large stone monument was erected over his grave, and a carefully selected sentiment throbs with meaning. Our precious one from us is gone. A voice we loved is stilled. A place is vacant in our heart, in our home, which never can be filled. Meanwhile, Sidney was arrested after the killing, but bond was immediately posted by his wealthy daddy. On Monday, after the Saturday violence, Sidney and Gladys, represented by Cullen Higgins, were subject to a hearing. Indictments were handed down. Bail was granted. For Sidney for $20,000, Gladys $8,000. Again, the bonds were promptly posted. Now, at this troubled point in her life, with a murder indictment hanging over her, Gladys fell in love. She was 25 at this point. Harrison Hamer, a cowboy and a former Texas Ranger, had been hired by Billy Johnson as a bodyguard. Well, Harrison's older brother, Big Frank Hamer, came to the ranch for a visit. At 32, Frank Hamer was a veteran of numerous gunfights as a Texas Ranger and in the capacity of other law enforcement positions. Currently, he was assigned to the Texas Cattle Raisers Association to hunt down rustlers with a commission as a special Texas Ranger. Hamer, a widower, was powerfully attracted to pretty Gladys. Gladys, embroiled in the most upsetting period of her life, she found Frank Hamer a tower of strength. Frank and Gladys traveled to New Orleans in May 1917 for marriage and a honeymoon. Trix and Beverly acquired a loving stepfather who made them carry a gun everywhere they went, by the way. And Billy Johnson acquired a formidable ally. Right after they married, Hamer thwarted an ambush that was aimed at Billy Johnson. Then, in September 1917, Gladys Hamer went on trial for murder in Lamesa. A change of venue had been ruled because sentiment was so blatantly pro-Johnson in Snyder. Cullen Higgins somehow persuaded the district attorney to drop the charges against Gladys. And shot her husband. Everybody saw her. She was the only surviving parent of 2 little girls. How do you explain this? She now was married to the widely respected Frank Hamer. The bullet she fired did not produce the fatal wounds, and she was a female in 1917. But all this is my speculation. We don't know how Cullen Higgins pulled it off because the trial testimony was removed from Lamisa's courthouse. Sidney Johnson came to trial in Baird, and he got off, but no testimony is available in the courthouse there. There's nothing about the death of Ed Sims in the Snyder courthouse. When Karen and I began investigating this feud in the 1990s, at courthouse after courthouse, we'd ask for so-and-so trial, they'd bring out the trial packet and have a few subpoenas in it. No testimony. Billy Johnson sent somebody around who made the legal testimony about Gladys and Sidney, his 2 babies, disappear. Another cover-up. Then, on October 1, 1917, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Hamer, Frank Gladys, accompanied by their brothers, Harrison Hamer and Emmett Johnson, were present for the opening trial procedure in Baird for Sidney Johnson. Afterwards, this quartet headed back toward Snyder with Frank driving. After 60 miles, they stopped in Sweetwater for a visit to the bathroom and to fix a flat. Gladys stayed in the car, while Harrison and Emmett headed for a toilet, and Frank went to the office of the garage, all unaware that G. McMeans had set an ambush. McMeans suddenly jumped out of a doorway right in front of Frank and shot him with a .45. Well, I've got you now, blank damn you, he said. But Hamer had only with .45, only been hit in the left shoulder. Well, he was a southpaw, and the heavy slug had paralyzed his arm. But instantly, he took a swipe at the .45 with his big right hand, knocking it downward just as it went off again, and the second bullet gouged into Hamer's right thigh. Ignoring his wounds, Hamer clutched the barrel of the .45, tore it from the grasp of McMeans, and it went flying, and then he began pounding him with